March 17, 1943, North Atlantic, 52 degrees north, 43 degrees west. The steel hull groaned, a sound like a hammer striking an anvil, but softened by the weight of 1,000 feet of seawater pressing down from above. Inside the cramped belly of U-618, the air hung thick with diesel fumes, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of fear. Kapitän Lieutenant Kurt Bayberg stood motionless in the control room, his hand resting against the cold periscope housing, listening. The crew had learned to read their commander's silence. When he stopped giving orders, when his jaw tightened and his eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond the pressure hull, it meant only one thing. Something was out there. Something was listening back. Then it came, a sound that did not belong to the ocean. Ping. A single metallic note, clear and deliberate, slicing through the natural symphony of creaking metal and churning water. It traveled through the hull like a ghost passing through walls, and every man aboard felt it resonate in his chest. The sonar operator, a 22-year-old from Hamburg, whose hands had not stopped trembling since they left Lorient 3 weeks prior, pressed his headphones tighter against his ears. His eyes widened. He turned slowly to Bayberg, and in that moment, no words were necessary. The hunter had become the hunted. What the crew of U-618 did not yet comprehend was that the sound they heard had traveled not from a few hundred meters away, but from a distance that defied everything they had been taught about submarine warfare. 20 miles, 32 kilometers, a range so extraordinary that it seemed to belong to science fiction rather than the grim arithmetic of naval combat. The American destroyer USS Bory had found them not through luck or chance encounter, but through a technological revolution that was rewriting the rules of war beneath the waves. And in that single ping, transmitted and received across an impossible distance, lay the death sentence for the U-boat fleet that had once prowled these waters with near impunity. This is the story of how sound became a weapon, how distance became irrelevant, and how the wolf packs of the Kriegsmarine discovered that the ocean itself had become their enemy. In the winter of 1942, the Battle of the Atlantic was reaching its crescendo of horror. German U-boats, operating in coordinated groups that the Allies grimly nicknamed wolf packs, were sending Allied merchant vessels to the bottom of the Atlantic at a rate that threatened to sever the lifeline between America and Britain. In November 1942 alone, U-boats sank 119 Allied ships, totaling over 700,000 tons of shipping. The mathematics were brutally simple. If the rate of sinking exceeded the rate of construction, Britain would starve, the Soviet Union would collapse, and Hitler's fortress Europe would become impregnable. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, calculated that if his submarines could maintain a sinking rate of 700,000 tons per month, the Allies would be forced to negotiate peace by the end of 1943. The North Atlantic had become a graveyard, and German submariners believed themselves to be the masters of this underwater realm. They had reason for confidence. The Type 7 U-boat represented the cutting edge of submarine design, capable of diving to 750 feet, remaining submerged for hours, and approaching convoys underwater where surface radar could not detect them. German torpedo technology had evolved into a sophisticated art, with acoustic homing torpedoes that could follow the sound signature of a fleeing merchant ship. The U-boat crews were the elite of the Kriegsmarine, volunteers who had survived months of grueling training and who carried themselves with the swagger of men who knew they held Germany's best chance of victory in their calloused hands. They had learned to navigate by the stars, to calculate firing solutions in their heads, to endure weeks of unwashed confinement in a steel tube that smelled of rot and fear. They had watched torpedoes strike home, had seen the orange glow of burning fuel oil on the horizon, had listened to the death screams of merchant ships, breaking apart as they plunged toward the ocean floor. What they expected in the spring of 1943 was more of the same. Intelligence reports suggested that Allied anti-submarine capabilities remained primitive. British destroyers still relied primarily on ASDIC, the sonar system developed in World War I, which had an effective range of approximately 1,500 yards under ideal conditions. German submariners had learned the rhythm of Allied convoy protection, surface radar that could spot a U-boat on the surface at night, forcing them to dive, followed by a game of blind man's bluff underwater where the advantage shifted back to the submarine. A U-boat commander who kept his nerve, who maintained silent running and allowed the hunters to pass overhead, could usually escape. The ocean was vast, detection ranges were short, and a submerged U-boat was nearly invisible. But something had changed, something the German Naval High Command did not yet understand. In the research laboratories of Bell Telephone, Western Electric, and the Columbia University Division of War Research, American scientists had been waging a different kind of war. They had turned their attention to the fundamental physics of underwater sound propagation, mapping the ocean's acoustic properties with the same systematic precision that Manhattan Project physicists were applying to atomic fission. They discovered that seawater was not a uniform medium, but a complex layering of temperature zones, salinity gradients, and pressure variations that could bend, reflect, and channel sound waves across extraordinary distances. They found that under certain conditions, a phenomenon called the deep sound channel could trap acoustic energy and transmit it horizontally for dozens of miles with minimal loss. They learned that the ocean thermocline, the boundary layer where warm surface water met cold, deep water, could act as a waveguide, focusing sonar pulses like a lens concentrating light. The result was a new generation of sonar systems that rendered the previous technology obsolete overnight. The QC sonar, installed on American destroyers beginning in late 1942, could detect a submerged submarine at ranges exceeding 15 miles under favorable conditions. The QHB system, paired with improved hydrophones, could track multiple targets simultaneously and calculate their bearing, range, and depth with unprecedented accuracy. But the true revolution was not merely in the hardware. American operators were being trained in a new doctrine of long-range acoustic hunting that treated the ocean as a three-dimensional chessboard, where every move could be anticipated, tracked, and countered. They learned to interpret the subtle variations in return echoes that distinguished a submarine from a whale, a wreck, or a thermal layer. They learned to predict where a U-boat would go based on water depth, current patterns, and the psychology of submarine commanders, who had been trained in tactics that were now lethally outdated. By March 1943, these systems were being deployed throughout the Atlantic Fleet, and the men who operated them were beginning to understand the magnitude of the advantage they possessed. But the German submariners, locked in their steel coffins beneath the waves, still believed they were invisible. Captain Lieutenant Baberg had taken U-618 deep the moment he heard that first ping. Standard procedure: dive to 200 meters, cut all unnecessary systems, reduce propeller speed to bare steerage way, and wait. The destroyer would pass overhead. The sonar would lose contact in the thermal layers, and within an hour they could resume their patrol. He had done this a dozen times before. The ocean was deep, and sound was a fickle thing that played tricks even on the most sophisticated equipment. He stood in the red-lit gloom of the control room, watching the depth gauge needle settle at 220 meters, and allowed himself a moment of confidence. They were safe. They were hidden. They were ping. The sound came again, just as clear as before, just as precise. And now there was something else, a rising pitch, a Doppler shift that told Baberg's experienced ears that the source was moving toward them. He glanced at the sonar operator, who was frantically adjusting his equipment, convinced that something must be malfunctioning, because the bearing was wrong. The sound was coming from a direction that suggested the destroyer was still miles away, far beyond the effective range of any sonar system known to German naval intelligence. It was impossible. It violated every principle of submarine warfare that had been drilled into them at the U-boat school in Neustadt. But the pings kept coming. Regular, methodical. Each one a reminder that somewhere up there, in the gray chaos of the surface world, an American destroyer was tracking their every movement with casual precision. What Baberg could not know, what no U-boat commander yet understood, was that the American destroyer above them was not guessing. The USS Boreas sonar operator, a 24-year-old from Michigan named James Porter, who had worked as a radio technician before the war, was watching U-618 on his scope with the clarity of a man reading a newspaper. The submarine's position was marked as a distinct blip on the plan position indicator, a glowing dot on a circular screen that showed bearing and range with mechanical certainty. Porter could see the U-boat turning, could track its depth changes by the variation in echo strength, could predict its next move based on the patterns that his training had taught him to recognize. He had been tracking this particular submarine for 42 minutes, since it had first appeared on his scope at a range of 18 miles. He had watched it attempt to evade, had noted the moment it dove deep, and had adjusted his sonar beam angle to maintain contact through the thermal layers. He was not hunting blindly. He was observing a target that had nowhere to hide. The captain of the Boreas, Commander Charles Hutchins, stood beside Porter, watching the plot develop. Hutchins was a veteran of convoy escort duty, who had spent 2 years learning the bitter lessons of the North Atlantic. He had seen merchant ships torn apart by torpedoes, had pulled survivors from oil-slicked water, had depth-charged suspected submarine contacts only to watch them slip away into the deep. But now, with this new sonar system, the entire character of the battle had shifted. He did not need to guess where the U-boat was. He knew, and that knowledge transformed everything. He gave the orders calmly, professionally. Increase speed to 20 knots. Adjust course to intercept. Prepare depth charge pattern Delta. The Boreas surged forward, her bow cutting through the Atlantic swells, and 20 miles away, in the darkness beneath the surface, Kapitänleutnant Baberg heard the shift in propeller sounds and felt the first cold touch of true fear. The German Naval High Command had built its U-boat strategy on a foundation of assumptions that were now crumbling. They had assumed that the Allies lacked the technology to detect submarines at long range. They had assumed that the vast expanse of the Atlantic provided sufficient space for wolf packs to operate without being systematically hunted. They had assumed that German engineering superiority, the same quality that had produced the Panzer tanks and the Messerschmitt fighters, would maintain the U-boat's dominance beneath the waves. These assumptions were not merely incorrect. They were catastrophically, lethally wrong. In the first 3 months of 1943, even as Donitz celebrated record-sinking totals, the tide was turning. Allied merchant ship losses began to decline, while U-boat casualties rose sharply. In March 1943, the month that U-618 encountered the Boreas, the Germans lost 15 U-boats in the Atlantic. In April, the number rose to 16. In May, a month that would become known as Black May in German naval history, 43 U-boats were destroyed. The kill rate had inverted. For every Allied merchant ship sunk, the Germans were now losing a submarine and its trained crew, men who required years to replace and could not be replaced at all once the training schools themselves came under Allied bombardment. The primary cause was not merely improved sonar. It was the systematic application of science to warfare on a scale that the German military establishment, for all its technical sophistication, had failed to match. American operational research teams had analyzed thousands of convoy encounters, depth charge attacks, and submarine sightings to determine optimal search patterns, attack spacing, and explosive depth settings. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park were reading German naval communications in near real time, allowing Allied commanders to route convoys around wolf pack concentrations and vector hunter-killer groups directly onto U-boat positions. Long-range patrol aircraft, equipped with centimetric radar that could spot a submarine's conning tower in darkness or fog, were closing the Atlantic Gap, the mid-ocean region where U-boats had previously operated beyond the reach of land-based air cover. And beneath all of this, invisible but decisive, was the revolution in underwater acoustics that had transformed the ocean from a hiding place into a killing ground. For the men aboard U-618, these strategic considerations were irrelevant abstractions. Their reality was confined to the 220 feet of steel tube that surrounded them, growing hotter and more fetid with each passing hour. Berg had ordered a crash dive to maximum depth, pushing the boat to 280 meters, well beyond the rated safety limit. The pressure hull groaned with sounds that made even the veteran crew members exchange glances. Water was beginning to seep through the stern gland, a thin stream that the engineering officer watched with barely controlled panic. The batteries were draining, the air was foul, and above them, that relentless pinging continued, tracking them with machine-like precision. They tried everything. They released a bold decoy, a chemical canister that created a cloud of bubbles meant to provide a false sonar return. The pinging did not waver. They executed a sharp turn and increased speed, hoping to break contact through maneuver. The pinging followed. They shut down all non-essential systems and drifted, becoming as silent as a tomb, hoping to sink below the thermocline and vanish into the deep, scattering layer where sonar beams lost coherence. The pinging, if anything, grew stronger. What they were experiencing was not merely superior technology. It was the collision of two different philosophies of war. The German U-boat service had been built on principles of individual daring, tactical flexibility, and the assumption that well-trained crews in excellent boats could overcome material disadvantages through skill and courage. The American anti-submarine campaign was built on industrial mass production, systematic scientific method, and the belief that warfare could be reduced to mathematics and engineering problems that admitted of calculable solutions. One side relied on the iron nerves of men like Kapitän-Leutnant Bauberg. The other side relied on the cold precision of machines like the QC Sonar, which did not care about courage, did not tire, did not doubt, and did not stop. The depth charges began falling at 14:27 hours. By the Boris log, 6 K-gun projectors hurled the 600-pound cylinders outward in a hexagonal pattern, while 2 more rolled off the stern racks. They were set to detonate at 300, 350, and 400 feet, a ladder pattern designed to bracket the target regardless of its exact depth. The first explosions reached U-618 as a sequence of hammer blows that seemed to strike the submarine from all directions simultaneously. The lights went out. Emergency lanterns flickered on, casting wild shadows across the control room. A gauge shattered, spraying glass across the navigation table. The hydrophone operator tore off his headphones with a cry of pain, blood trickling from his ears where the acoustic shockwave had ruptured his eardrums. Berg held onto the periscope housing, his knuckles white, his face expressionless. This was the moment that every U-boat commander knew would eventually come. The moment when the Hunter's calculations resolved into high explosive, when abstract tactical problems became a test of whether German engineering could withstand American industrial might. The hull groaned and flexed. Somewhere aft, men were shouting about a leak in the battery compartment, the worst possible place for seawater to penetrate. Chlorine gas, the inevitable product of saltwater meeting battery acid, was already drifting through the boat, adding another layer of horror to an environment that had become indistinguishable from hell. A second pattern fell. Closer this time, the concussions lifted the stern of the boat and dropped it with a violence that sent men sprawling across the deck plates. A pipe burst, filling the engine room with scalding steam. The chief engineer was screaming into the intercom that they had lost main hydraulics, that the dive planes were jammed, that they were losing depth control. The depth gauge needle was oscillating wildly, but the general trend was clear. They were sinking. not in the controlled manner of a submarine executing a tactical dive, but in the helpless manner of a ship that had sustained fatal damage and was beginning its final journey to the ocean floor. Berg made the decision that every U-boat commander dreaded. He ordered emergency surface. It was an admission of defeat, an acknowledgement that they could no longer fight from beneath the waves. But it was also the only chance of survival. The crew triggered the compressed air systems, blowing water from the ballast tanks in a desperate attempt to generate positive buoyancy. The submarine shuddered, hesitated, and then began to rise. As they climbed toward the surface, Berg found himself thinking not about tactics or duty, but about something he had seen during his last leave in Hamburg. A propaganda poster showing a U-boat commander standing heroically on his conning tower, the caption reading, "We sail against England." It seemed, in this moment, like an artifact from another universe. A universe where confidence and courage were sufficient. A universe that had ceased to exist. U-618. Heat broke surface at 1441 hours. The conning tower hatch burst open, and Berg pulled himself up into the pale March sunlight, gasping air that tasted impossibly sweet after the toxic atmosphere below. The ocean stretched empty in all directions except one. There, closing at high speed, bow-wave white and prominent, was the USS Bory. And even from this distance, Berg could see the gun crews running to their stations, could see the ship's armament training in his direction. He had perhaps 60 seconds before those guns opened fire. Not enough time to dive again, not enough time to abandon ship, barely enough time to raise the white flag that he had never imagined he would need. The surrender of U-618 was recorded in clinical detail in the Bory's action report. The American destroyer approached to within 400 yards, covering the submarine with 3-inch guns and 20 mm cannons. 47 German sailors evacuated the sinking U-boat, were pulled from the water by American rescue parties, and were held as prisoners of war for the duration of the conflict. 3 men died in the depth charge attack. The submarine itself slipped beneath the waves 15 minutes after surfacing, settling to the ocean floor at a depth of approximately 2,200 fathoms. Its location is unmarked on any chart, one more steel coffin among thousands scattered across the Atlantic seabed. But the significance of this encounter extended far beyond the fate of a single submarine and its crew. U-618 was not an isolated loss. It was a data point in a larger pattern that German naval intelligence was only beginning to recognize. Throughout March and April 1943, U-boat commanders were reporting inexplicable contacts with Allied escorts at ranges that defied existing technical understanding. They described being tracked through evasive maneuvers, pursued through thermal layers, hunted with a persistence that suggested the enemy possessed either supernatural perception or a technology that German scientists had not anticipated. The commanders who survived these encounters spoke in tones of bewilderment and suppressed panic. Those who did not survive left behind only the silence of missing patrol reports and the gradually dawning realization at U-boat headquarters that something fundamental had changed in the Battle of the Atlantic. May 24, 1943, Admiral Dönitz made a decision that effectively conceded defeat in the Atlantic campaign. He ordered all U-boats to withdraw from the North Atlantic convoy routes and redeploy to less heavily defended areas. The official justification cited improved Allied air cover and the need to preserve submarine forces for future operations. But the confidential communications within the German Naval High Command told a different story. They described an enemy who could detect U-boats at ranges exceeding 15 miles, who possessed acoustic tracking systems against which no effective countermeasure existed, and who had transformed the Atlantic from a hunting ground into a trap. The wolf packs, which had once prowled these waters with arrogant confidence, were now advised to avoid combat whenever possible, and to transit submerged areas only under cover of darkness. It was not a tactical adjustment. It was an admission that the technological balance had shifted irrevocably against the Kriegsmarine. The symbol of this transformation, in the memories of the survivors, was that sound, the ping, that single metallic note that could reach across 20 miles of ocean and announce with mechanical certainty that there was nowhere left to hide. German submariners began to speak of it in tones usually reserved for supernatural phenomena. Some claimed they could hear it in their dreams, could wake up in cold sweats, believing they were still trapped beneath the surface, while that sound hunted them through the deep. The psychological impact was profound and debilitating. A U-boat crew that believed itself invisible could operate with bold aggression. A crew that knew it was being tracked from the moment it submerged operated in a state of constant fear that eroded discipline, degraded performance, and made every patrol an exercise in sustained terror. The American and British anti-submarine forces discovered something that military strategists had long theorized but rarely proven: that the psychological effect of superior technology could be as decisive as the physical destruction it enabled. The knowledge that the enemy possessed capabilities against which no defense existed created a kind of learned helplessness among U-boat crews. They began to make mistakes, to abandon attacks prematurely, to surface in panic rather than endure the stress of silent running. The confidence that had characterized the happy time of 1940-1941, when U-boats sank Allied shipping almost at will, evaporated. In its place came a grim fatalism, a recognition that each patrol might be the last, that the odds had shifted from favorable to overwhelmingly negative. The prisoners from U-618, interrogated at a facility outside Boston, provided Allied intelligence with valuable insights into the psychological state of the U-boat service. They described crews that had lost faith in their equipment, commanders who had stopped believing in victory, and a general sense that the war beneath the waves had become unwinnable. Kapitän-Leutnant Bauberg, when pressed about the moment he realized his submarine had been detected, spoke at length about that first ping. He described it as a revelation, a moment when the comfortable assumptions that had sustained him through 3 years of war collapsed all at once. He had believed, as all U-boat commanders believed, that the ocean depths provided sanctuary. He had trained to exploit this sanctuary, to use the ocean's vastness as both shield and weapon. And then, in an instant, that belief had been revealed as an illusion. The ocean was not his ally. It was not neutral. It had become, through the application of American science and technology, an instrument of his own destruction. This was the bitter lesson that German submariners learned in the spring of 1943, and it was a lesson that extended beyond mere tactical considerations. The entire German military establishment had been constructed on a foundation of technological confidence. They had pioneered blitzkrieg warfare, had developed jet aircraft and ballistic missiles, had created the Tiger tank and the acoustic torpedo. They had assumed that German engineering represented the apex of military science, that their enemies might match them in industrial output, but could never surpass them in innovation. The revelation that American and British scientists had achieved breakthroughs in fields that German researchers had barely explored was more than a military setback. It was an ideological crisis. The Nazi regime had predicated its claim to dominance on theories of Aryan superiority, on the belief that German culture produced a quality of military and scientific excellence that other nations could not replicate. The U-boat service, in particular, had been held up as proof of this theory. These were the elite warriors of the Kriegsmarine, the men whose courage and skill were supposed to compensate for Allied material advantages. But courage and skill meant nothing when the enemy could track you from 20 miles away, when the ocean itself had been turned into a surveillance grid, when every advantage of stealth and surprise had been negated by technologies you did not understand and could not counter. The ideological implications were profound. If German submariners, the best trained and most experienced in the world, could be hunted to extinction by enemies wielding superior technology, what did that suggest about the fundamental premises of the Nazi worldview? The prisoners did not articulate this crisis in explicitly political terms, but it was there in the way they spoke about American industrial capacity, about the apparently endless supply of destroyers and escort carriers, about the casual abundance of resources that allowed the Allies to deploy advanced sonar systems on dozens of escort vessels simultaneously. They had been told that America was a soft democracy, corrupted by capitalism and weakened by racial mixing. They had expected to face enemies who were materially wealthy but spiritually hollow. What they encountered instead were professionals who operated with ruthless efficiency, who had turned warfare into an engineering problem and had solved it with the same systematic precision that American factories applied to assembly line production. The cognitive dissonance was acute and unresolvable. One particular aspect of American anti-submarine operations seemed to crystallize this dissonance in the minds of the captured Germans. It was not the sonar technology itself, impressive though it was. It was the food. When Bayberg and his crew were pulled from the water by the Boris rescue parties, they were immediately given hot coffee and sandwiches. Real coffee, not the ersatz substitute that had become standard in the German military. Fresh white bread with actual butter, ham, and cheese. After weeks of surviving on moldy black bread, canned sardines, and stale water, the contrast was shocking. Bayberg later recalled watching an American sailor casually toss aside a half-eaten sandwich because he claimed he wasn't that hungry. The half-sandwich contained more protein than a U-boat crew member's daily ration. This casual abundance, this thoughtless waste, was more demoralizing in its way than the depth charge attack that had preceded it. The food became a symbol, discussed endlessly among the prisoners. It represented something they had not anticipated and could not reconcile with their understanding of how war worked. They had been taught that Germany, through discipline and superior organization, could overcome material disadvantages. They had accepted privation as the price of military excellence. But the Americans were not suffering privation. The Americans were fighting a war while maintaining living standards that seemed, to German eyes, almost decadent. The crew of the Bory ate 3 hot meals daily. They had fresh water for showers. They received mail and care packages from home with a regularity that seemed miraculous. And they operated sonar equipment that could track submarines across distances measured in tens of miles. The correlation seemed obvious, though none of the German prisoners wanted to state it explicitly. A society wealthy enough to feed its sailors steak and eggs for breakfast was wealthy enough to fund the research programs that produced revolutionary sonar systems. This realization that abundance and military effectiveness were not opposing forces but complementary aspects of the same industrial power represented a fundamental challenge to German military culture. The Wehrmacht had built its identity around the concept of resourcefulness under adversity, the ability to achieve victory despite material limitations. German soldiers were expected to fight harder, march longer, and endure greater suffering than their enemies. This was presented as a source of strength, proof of superior will and determination. But what if abundance itself was a strategic advantage? What if a well-fed, well-equipped, well-rested crew simply performed better than one that had been living on iron rations and fetid air for 3 weeks? What if the American and British strategy of overwhelming material superiority was not a sign of weakness, but an expression of a different and more effective philosophy of warfare? These questions haunted the survivors of U-618 during their captivity. They had time to reflect, to compare notes with prisoners from other submarines, to gradually assemble a picture of a war that was being lost not through lack of courage, but through fundamental miscalculations at the highest levels of German strategy. They learned that the U-boat campaign, which had seemed so promising in 1942, had killed more German submariners than it had accomplished in strategic value. Of the approximately 40,000 men who served in the U-boat force during World War II, roughly 30,000 died. It was the highest casualty rate of any branch of service in any nation's military. These men had been sent into the Atlantic in vessels that were increasingly obsolete. pursuing a strategy that had been overtaken by technological developments, fighting an enemy who could detect them from distances that made evasion impossible. The tragedy, from the perspective of the survivors, was not merely that they had lost. It was that the loss had been predictable, that the men directing the war from Berlin had continued to send submarines into the Atlantic long after it became clear that the strategic situation had become untenable. Admiral Dönitz, even as casualty rates climbed, maintained public statements about the U-boat service's vital importance and imminent victory. New crews continued to be trained and deployed, fed into a battle that had become a slaughter. The survivors understood, with the bitter clarity that only defeat can provide, that they had been sacrificed not to achieve victory, but to maintain the illusion that victory was still possible. Captain Lieutenant Bayberg spent the remainder of the war at a prisoner-of-war camp in Oklahoma, working on a farm and learning, slowly, that the Americans he had been taught to despise were neither weak nor decadent. They were, instead, people who had organized their society around principles that generated extraordinary productive capacity, and who had applied that capacity to warfare with devastating effectiveness. He would later write, in memoirs published decades after the war, that the moment he truly understood Germany's defeat was not when U-618 surfaced under the Boris guns. It was during a Thanksgiving dinner at the POW camp, when the American commandant arranged for the German prisoners to receive the same meal as the guards: turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, mashed potatoes, pumpkin pie. The abundance was staggering, and Bayberg realized, with a sense of weary resignation, that a nation capable of feeding even its enemies this well was a nation that could never be defeated through military force alone. The Battle of the Atlantic, historians would later determine, effectively ended in May 1943. The U-boat service continued to operate, continued to sink Allied ships, continued to tie down resources in convoy protection and anti-submarine patrols. But it never again posed an existential threat to the Allied war effort. The technological advantages that emerged in the spring of 1943, long-range sonar, centimetric radar, improved depth charges, acoustic homing torpedoes, systematic operational research, had permanently shifted the balance. The ocean, which had once been neutral territory where skill and daring could compensate for material disadvantages, had become a transparent medium, where every submarine could be tracked, located, and destroyed with mechanical efficiency. The men who served in the U-boat force after May 1943 knew this. They went to sea understanding that the odds were against them, that each patrol was more likely to end in death than in survival. Some continued from a sense of duty, some from loyalty to their comrades, some simply because refusing was not an option. But the confidence was gone. The belief that they were the masters of the underwater realm had been shattered by that sound, that ping, that metallic note that announced the presence of an enemy who could see through darkness and distance and depth. The wolf packs had been defanged, and the men who sailed in them knew it. In the decades after the war, as veterans from both sides gathered at reunions and conferences, they would sometimes discuss these encounters. The American sonar operators would explain, in technical terms, how the QC system worked, how they had been trained to interpret the acoustic returns, how the ocean's thermal structure could be exploited to extend detection ranges. The German submariners would listen with the fascination of men learning the mechanism of their own defeat. And inevitably, the conversation would turn to that moment when the ping first reached them through the hull. When the comfortable assumptions of submarine warfare dissolved, when they realized that the ocean was no longer their sanctuary, but their prison. Some would speak of it with dark humor, others with lingering bitterness, but all of them recognized it as the turning point, the instant when the war beneath the waves shifted irrevocably. Against the Kriegsmarine, the legacy of this technological revolution extended far beyond World War II. The sonar systems developed during the Battle of the Atlantic became the foundation for Cold War. submarine detection networks, for the SOSUS arrays that monitored Soviet submarine movements, for the acoustic principles that govern anti-submarine warfare to this day. The operational research methods pioneered by Allied scientists became standard practice in military planning across all domains. And the fundamental lesson, that industrial capacity and scientific innovation could be as decisive as battlefield courage, shaped military doctrine for generations. But for the men who experienced it firsthand, for the survivors of boats like U-618, who heard that impossible ping reaching through 20 miles of ocean to mark them for destruction, the meaning was more immediate and more personal. They had learned that technology could strip away the veil of invisibility that had made their service possible. They had discovered that the ocean, vast and deep as it was, could not protect them from an enemy who had learned to make sound itself into a weapon. And they had recognized, in that hard school of defeat, that the confidence they had carried into battle was founded not on reality, but on the failure of their own intelligence services to understand what the Allies had achieved. The ping. That single sound became, in memory, the symbol of everything that had gone wrong with the U-boat campaign. It represented the moment when the hunter became the hunted, when invisibility became transparency, when the advantage shifted irreversibly to the other side. It echoed through the testimony of prisoners, through the after-action reports of surviving commanders, through the calculations of German naval strategists who tried to understand how their most potent weapon had been neutralized so completely. And it resonated, most powerfully of all, in the silence of the 30,000 submariners who never returned, who died in steel tombs at the bottom of the Atlantic, hunted by enemies they never saw, and tracked by systems they never understood. In the end, the story of U-618 and the USS Bori is not merely a tale of tactical innovation or technological superiority. It is a story about the nature of modern warfare, about how conflicts are won not only by the courage of men, but by the societies that equip them, feed them, and give them tools that transform the battlefield itself. The German submariners were not lacking in bravery. They were not inferior as sailors or as warriors. But they were serving a regime that had built its military strategy on ideology rather than reality, that had assumed superiority rather than earning it through systematic scientific advancement, and that had sent them into battle against an enemy who had learned to make the ocean itself into an instrument of destruction. 20 miles. That was the distance across which the ping had traveled, an impossible distance that became routine, that became the new standard for underwater detection. 20 miles was the distance between the world as German submariners believed it to be, and the world as it actually was. It was the distance between confidence and despair, between the illusion of invulnerability and the reality of systematic defeat. And for Kapitänleutnant Kurt Bayberg, standing on the conning tower of his dying submarine with the white flag in his hands, and the American destroyer closing in, it was the distance between the warrior he had believed himself to be and the prisoner of war he was about to become. The ocean remembers these things. In the deep trenches where U-618 lies broken and corroding, the steel hull occasionally shifts as currents disturb the sediment. Perhaps, if one could listen carefully enough, with instruments sensitive enough to detect the faintest acoustic signatures, one might still hear echoes of that day. The metallic groan of a pressure hull under stress, the thunder of depth charges, and beneath it all, persistent and inescapable, the sound that announced the end of an era. Ping. A single note, traveling through darkness and distance, carrying a message that could not be ignored and could not be escaped. You are seen. You are tracked. You are no longer safe. The ocean itself has learned to hunt. And in that sound, repeated across 1,000 encounters throughout the spring and summer of 1943, lay the truth that would determine the outcome of the war. Not the truth of courage or ideology or racial superiority, but the simple, brutal truth that in modern warfare, the society that can mobilize science, industry, and abundance in pursuit of victory will prevail over the society that relies on discipline, sacrifice, and will. The American ping, reaching across 20 miles of ocean, was not merely a technological achievement. It was the sound of democracy at war, of a free society that had chosen to apply its immense productive capacity to the systematic defeat of tyranny. And once that sound was heard, once its implications were understood, the outcome was never in doubt. The hunters had become the hunted. The wolf packs had been defeated, and the Battle of the Atlantic, though it would grind on for 2 more years, had already been decided by that impossible, inexorable, inescapable sound. The ping that traveled 20 miles and announced that the ocean, vast and deep as it was, had finally run out of places to hide.